Welcome everybody to this session on career transitions. As you'll see at the beginning of the presentation, this is something that occurs in today's working life more and more often. And what I'm going to be trying to do is to sort of give you a framework for planning your next step. Marcia has already introduced herself and partly introduced me. So yes, I work for UNHCR in the career management section. My expertise is in career planning and in job hunting. We often confuse the two, and this is something that we'll be touching on in this presentation. And I've been working in the realm of career management for probably about 16 years, so quite a long time, working with different organizations in terms of recruitment, interviewing them, finding out what sort of career paths they can expect in those organizations, and then because it's recruitment, also a lot of information around what makes candidates stand out, why do they select one candidate over another, what is it that makes them so special. So I'm going to be sharing some of that knowledge not only in this webinar but in the next 4 that we'll be running as part of this career transition series. So this is the program. So today we're going to be focusing on, what is career transition, a little bit of what really is career management, and then around planning your next step. And then in the coming months, we'll be doing 1 webinar a month focusing on how to approach the job market, because often we don't really understand the dynamics of the job market. How do people actually get jobs? And this often leads us to use strategies which are not so effective. They can work, but only maybe a tiny percentage of the time. So we'll be, focusing a session on how does the job market work, so you can set a strategy which is much more effective for you. And then the last 3 sessions will be very much focusing on your what they call marketing tools in the outside world. In the humanitarian sector, it would be more, the application tools that you might have, but these tend to be CV, motivation letters, and then of course preparing for interviews, which usually takes place after the application. So that's a little bit the program for the coming months, and this is a program that we tend to run within UNHCR for operations that are undergoing restructuring. So it's quite comprehensive in terms of getting an understanding of what is career management, what is the job market, and then building the tools and the skills that you need to approach the job market effectively. So that was a little bit about me and about the program. Marcia's already said, the fantastic number of countries that you're all currently based on. But a few more questions for you. If you could say, okay, maybe you're based in Kiva right now or in Cameroon, but where are you actually from? Which UN agency you're currently with? And then how many years of work experience do you have? I know it's many questions to quote out, but then Marcia, maybe you could just give me a sort of quick summary of, I see that people are in these from these different places, in these different agencies, and then roughly on average, the number of years of experience is, whatever it is. So if you could just write in the chat, where you're from, which agency you're in, and how many years of work experience do you have. And just to tell you a little bit about me, so I'm actually South American, despite the very British accent. So I was born in Brazil, but spent my childhood between Peru and Argentina. My mother's Argentine, but I come from a family from my grandparents who are more or less all British. So that's where I'm from. Currently, I'm based in Hungary in the Global Services Center that UNHCR has here. Of course, I'm working for UNHCR. And how many years of experience? I'm a bit embarrassed, but it means I have a lot of experience, so 27 years of experience. So Marcia, go ahead to see what people are saying.
Brilliant, thank you for that. So we have, let me see. So we have Nazir from Sudan, we have Reina from Japan working in Rwanda, UNDP with 13 years of work experience. We have Agnes from Cameroon based in Niger with UNDP with 9 years of experience. We have Mariko from Japan based in Cambodia with UNICEF, 4 or 5 years of work experience. Marinella from the Philippines in South Sudan with 20 plus years of experience. Joel Ocha in Dakar, 11 years of experience. India Braburu from India, based in Sudan, with 23 years of experience and 7 years as UNV. Richard from Guinea-Conakry, working in Congo, Brazzaville with UNICEF and almost 8 years of experience. Richard from the States, currently working with OCHA in the Philippines with 10 years of experience. Ermir Unama, so in Afghanistan, is Albanian Canadian with 4 years of experience. Also worked 2 years in HCR in Liberia. Kiva, she's from Ireland. She is in Lusaka with UNDP and has 8-9 years of experience. John, working in Cameroon with UNHCR. Angela from Sweden, but born in Cameroon, working with UN Women in Dakar. From Nepal, we have Kesh, working in Uganda with UNHCR, also 8 years of experience. We have Amani from DRC. We have Carolina, Chilean, working in DRC as well, 5 years in the UN, 7 years in the private sector. Kamzan from Ivory Coast, working for UNHCR. We have Liviana, working for UNDP in Bangkok. We have also Alda in UNMIK in Kosovo. Juliana from Ukraine, also working for UNHCR in Georgia. UNICEF again. In Vietnam, we have Andrea with UNICEF. From El Salvador, Cote d'Ivoire, Mozambique, Ifa, another Irish with 17 years of experience working with UNICEF. So I would say overall, Rosie, we have many colleagues from UNDP, many colleagues from UNICEF, UNHCR as well, and some with the peacekeeping mission. So we have UNMIK, UNAMA, UNAMID, MONUSCO also here represented. And in terms of geographical spread, mostly from the African region, some in Asia as well. Yeah.
And I've seen also a couple of colleagues from South America. Fantastic. And it was just to get an understanding in terms of how many years of experience you've had. So, how many times maybe in your previous career you have already undertaken a career transition. Some of this might feel new. Some of it might feel I'm doing a refresher. And hopefully I'll be giving you some perspective in terms of what career management is today. So thank you for that, and welcome to the session, everybody. It's just lovely to be with people from so many different places. Now, another factor I wanted to ask you, often we use the analogy of careers as a river. And like all rivers, sometimes it can get a little rough. Sometimes it might feel that you're not on the river at all. You're on the side looking as the river goes past. Sometimes you might feel that you're not the only one on the boat, and that you're actually carrying, family obligations, with you. This could also represent actually a team who's going through, a rough patch in the rapids, but they look as if they're having fun and they're highly stimulated. Sometimes the river might take you past the most incredible of places, and I love this picture of this couple looking at this amazing elephant. And then other times it can look really very scary, like this guy. Maybe he's having fun, but he's about to jump into the unknown, and you don't really know what's going to happen at the other end. And then, of course, sometimes careers feel as if you're stuck in the mud. You're not going anywhere. You feel you're very stagnant. You're not developing anything. You're not stimulated. And to the point that maybe you might feel you're in the wrong river, and actually what you need to do is to pick up your boat, go up the hill to the next valley where there's another river. This is called portage for those that like canoeing, and this is a very good analogy for sometimes something that we need to do, which is to change radically, sectors, functions, etc. So again, a question for you: out of these 6 images, where do you feel you're at right now? Which picture do you identify with most? And maybe if you're in a picture that doesn't represent, that's not represented here, just tell us what picture that might be. So again, Marcia, if you could give me an idea of where people are at.
Yes, so I'm I actually have a bit of everything. So we have on the left, which I assume is the person on their own. We have the second, the fourth, the one with the canoe, the one with the hovering boat, not even touching the surface of water. First one, first on the second one, and so on. So I think we have a bit of everything. What perhaps we can ask is why they feel they are they affiliate themselves with that picture most, and perhaps I can unmute some of the colleagues. If anybody wants to talk, just let me know on the chat, and I will unmute you. ER, you were the first one to respond. Would you be okay if I unmuted you and you perhaps you can explain which image you feel most closely affiliated with and why? ER, you can speak now if you want. Oh, Jacques wants to respond. Please, Jacques, feel free. I'll unmute you. Yeah, here you go. You can speak now. Jacques?
Maybe he's speaking and we can't hear. I mean, not a problem. I mean, it's very, very normal when I'm delivering this career webinar that you should actually have people in different stages in their career. Some people might feel very stimulated. Some people might feel very burdened by the responsibility of what they're doing. Some might feel incredibly stagnant. Another feel, sufficiently frustrated to feel that they need to make a move. I think the point that I'd like to make with this exercise is that whatever stage you're at, it doesn't have to be forever. Life has a wonderful way of bringing us new things and new opportunities, etc. So whatever it is that you're feeling, I think we always need to feel that it's not going to be forever, that, get some perspective, that this is a stage in your career. And like all rivers, it has, very fast-moving water at some times, some very slow-moving water at other times. And as I mentioned, sometimes that you might be stagnated or feeling in absolute ecstasy. So, whatever, I guess the first key message is always perspective, that this is only one stage and it doesn't have to be forever, that career management is about career development, and therefore, so long as we, this is what we're going to talk about in this webinar, so long as we put things in place, you can move on to the next stage.
And Rosie, I have some of the comments here from some of the colleagues, and they're saying that they do like what they're doing. They just need the right tools to be able to move forward. So they don't quite know how to move forward, but they are in the right. They feel they are in the right career. They feel they are doing the right things. But then, what is next? No? How can we continue, and how can we maximize this career progression?
Fantastic. I mean, this is very much what this session is about, because the framework that I'm going to be presenting could be applied to moving out of an organization into a different sector, maybe even changing job functions, as much as actually developing your own career where you are, because you're in the right track, that you like the function, etc. So it can be applied to both situations. Okay, so I mean, that was a little bit to talk about your objectives around the session, to understand a little bit where you're at. Let me talk a little bit about how I'm going to structure the webinar. So the first thing is that I want to provide an overview of what career planning is today, because as I'll show you, it's a very different picture from what maybe my father, who would have been 86 this year, confronted throughout his career. There is a lot of change, and that's having a huge impact in our way and capacity for managing careers. And then I'm going to be talking about this framework of how to plan your next step. What are the issues around planning that we seem to suffer from? So to address those, and then take you through this step by step of where do I start, so I can give you a good framework in terms of, okay, these are the different things that I need to put in place in order to plan my next step, be this within the same function in the same sector, or actually this is an opportunity to try something different. So to give you a little bit of perspective in terms of what's happened with career management and career planning, up to the 1970s, career planning, and the best image I could come up with was like going in a train. So there were very few career tracks. My father, I think, was given the option of you can either be an engineer or a lawyer, more or less. So very few things that you can necessarily do. Career choice was a once-in-lifetime event. So when you graduated from university, you were told, or even before you went to university, if you had to be a lawyer, clearly you had to study law. But that choice was one-time thing, and once you were in there, it was very likely you're going to be there for the rest of your life. Often with the same organization. So you joined my father joined as a trainee in a multinational. You basically were put from department to department, different geographical areas, etc. And hopefully you would then at some point retire with a pension from the company. So things were very stable, very predictable, and most people, and this is at all levels, had a job for life. Now, against that, changing careers was seen as very unacceptable. Maybe my father changed careers, so he was completely out of the norm. But it was actually something that was seen as, if you're changing so much, you must be unreliable. Why is it that you're changing? Are you somebody that we can trust, etc. So that's a little bit what it was like until the 1970s. Now, as you might remember or not, or you might know, at the beginning of the 70s, we had the first big recession with the quadrupling of the oil price, and things in the economy started becoming a lot more unpredictable. So by the 1990s, career planning had become much more like going in a car. Organizations, didn't even know if they were going to exist in the next 5 years, so they were no longer able to offer a job for life. On the other hand, things were changing, things were growing, so there was a lot more going on in the job market, and so there was more flexibility, which meant that career choice now became a series of junctions. That you want this idea of a job for life and a career for life was a little bit, already outdated, and so it did mean that actually you couldn't stay in the same function across different sectors. Or change functions within a certain sector. So career paths definitely started to change, and it became a lot more acceptable to change careers. And also the relationship between whether it's the organization that's organizing a career for you versus the employee actually deciding, no, it's up to me, that relationship began to change. Before, it was clearly in the hands of the organizations. Now it started becoming much more in the hands of the employee themselves. Nowadays, with all the things that are going on, and that includes technological developments, globalization, a lot of instability around the world, politically, economically. Now it's career planning. It has become a much more difficult thing because the landscape is changing as you go along. Maybe 10 years ago, job functions like community manager, which is people managing the social image of a company, didn't exist at all. or digital identifier and recruitment. That didn't exist at all. And people that spend all day searching for candidates on LinkedIn, that type of job function didn't exist at all. So technology is driving a lot of change. But then, of course, there are all these other forces, which mean that the landscape is shifting all the time. So it's impossible to plan when actually even the sand behind, underneath you is changing all the time. So on the one hand, it becomes much more unpredictable, and that can raise a certain level of stress. But on the other hand, it's also tremendously exciting because there's a lot of new things going on that mean that you can actually shift your career in different directions. But it does mean that the career destination is now often unknown. And I like this image of somebody trekking in the Karakoram Mountains because the way that I see it is, generally you have an idea that you're going to cross this mountain range, but you have absolutely no idea of how you're going to do that. Because when you go up one mountain, suddenly, that's where you start realizing, okay, how can I go down to the next valley? When you're in that valley, you have to cross another mountain, but you don't have this sort of very planned way of viewing your future career. Now, the number of options also leads to what has been defined as a paradox of choice, that on principle, choice is a very good thing, but there's an optimal level of choice before it starts becoming stressful because you have so much choice that you're actually paralyzed. You can't actually decide. So on the one hand, it's a good thing. On the other hand, we also have to learn how to manage the responsibility of having so much choice before us. And then finally, the ownership over the whole issue of how you manage your career, how you develop your career, is very much in the hands of the employee now. Companies or organizations can offer training programs, can offer career development programs, etc. But it's very much up to the employee to really understand what's happening in the landscape, to anticipate needs, to develop their careers, to make sure they remain employable in the market. So what implications does that have for us that are now currently in working and part of the global workforce? Is first of all that career management is an ongoing process because, by definition, if the landscape is changing and there are new exciting things happening all the time, you're going to have to be revising this process all the time. So that would be the first point. And then the other is what they call the knowledge and skills life cycle, which is how long your knowledge and experience is actually something which is valid, and before it becomes obsolete, it's becoming shorter and shorter. So it's very important to understand that what you have won't necessarily get you where you want to go. So there are some sectors that have been hugely impacted by technology, and if we don't take up the challenge of learning about technology, learning what impact that's going to have on the way that we work or what we do, then very quickly you're going to become obsolete. So it's very much up to us to make sure that we start always looking at what's happening in my function. What are the latest developments? What is it that I need to know? And this can be both in terms of knowledge and, of course, in terms of skills. Many organizations are talking about new competencies that didn't exist 15 years ago. So issues around dealing with uncertainty, for example, you never saw that in a competency framework a while ago, whereas now it's very much a competency that is looked for. Another factor is also the whole issue of what career success is also changing enormously. Because organizations are becoming flatter and flatter, not necessarily within the UN system, I have to say, but it means that career success is very much about, being employable rather than necessarily getting to the top, because there may not actually be a hierarchy at the top to get to, because of organizations are becoming so much flatter. Then there's a whole issue, as I mentioned, that with this changing landscape, human beings, and in fact, no animal is conditioned to deal comfortably with uncertainty. We like the security of knowing what's going to happen, and I didn't realize that about animals, but when they're out in the savannah, you think, oh, it's pure freedom. No, animals have very, very set habits, because that's what gives them the security of understanding, where the potential predators are, where the dangers are, etc. And we as human beings are the same, but we are dealing in a world in which things are changing all the time. So we have to learn that capacity for dealing with and navigating uncertainty, and developing what we call career resilience. And my theory is that if you do the part of always maintaining yourself up to date, making sure that you're ahead of the curve in terms of what's happening in your function and in your sector, you're going to develop a lot more career resilience, because you know that your value in the market is always going to be valued. That is going to be important to somebody because you have developed the skills that employers need. And then finally, developing what is career management knowledge, skills, and attitudes. I'll show you what these are. But I think one of the greatest tragedies in life is that nobody teaches us how to manage our careers. I certainly was never taught it at school or at university. And basically what happens is that you graduate, you're kind of launched into the world and you know, expected to swim basically on your own. And there is actually an art to career management. And what are we talking about? So knowledge of what when you're talking about career management? Well, firstly, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, knowledge of yourself, you know, understanding who you are, what you can offer, and the way that you like to work. The knowledge of what's available and how to access those opportunities. Because we haven't been taught this, we tend to do what everybody else does, and often the wrong thing, and that's why often job hunting is so tremendously difficult for us, because we've never been taught how to do it well. And there's also knowledge on how to take decisions. I mentioned the paradox of choice. One is having to, you know, decide between different options, etc. And we need to learn how to take these decisions so that we get what we want, rather than what basically others might be driving, for example. When it comes to skills in career management, I would say primarily it's about interpersonal skills. So communication, very, very fundamental, but also developing relationships. You know, we've all seen the impact that a good reputation or a bad reputation has on somebody's career, and developing relationships and understanding what impact that can have on your career is tremendously important for effective career management. Then there's the issue of information management. So, you know, you need to be good at researching opportunities, understanding how to manage information, you know, when you present things, so that you're able to, on the one hand, identify opportunities, but then also, you know, build this reputation based on your research, etc. And of course, when it comes to job hunting, the whole skill in presenting yourself, both in applications, in interviews, but then also day to day, you know, holding a meeting, you're managing a conference. So it's not only in the job hunting phase, it's also during your work, you know, day to day. And then finally, when we're talking about attitudes, what are we talking about? I'll talk about a very particular career theory, which is very, you know, validated, and particular attitudes that Krumble talks about. But what type of things are we talking about? Yes, resilience. So, you know, understanding that what might be happening now is not forever. What can I do about it? Being confident, and being okay from, you know, getting out of the comfort zone, making mistakes, because you understand that that's the only way that you're going to learn. But there's also issues around, you know, being driven, being optimistic about what opportunities are out there. And then, of course, curiosity for what's going on, being very open-minded and flexible. You know, these are all things which are very, very important and increasingly important in today's changing world. So I mentioned this career theory. It's called planned happenstance. You know, the title may feel contradictory, because how can you have something which is happenstance and then at the same time it's also planned? Krumble's developed this theory post a lot of the financial crises in the 1990s. And what is he talking about? He says in this changing world where things are shifting all the time, it's that capacity for being able to respond to new opportunities which may arise, and then also being flexible enough to change directions. And that's the kind of stance that you have to have. So on the one hand, you can have your general plan, but on the other hand, you have to be tremendously open to this, you know, new opportunities which are arising, and have that sense of curiosity to find out about them, and then decide, actually, I know that this was my plan, but maybe I should be shifting a little bit to the left, because that's really where the opportunities are. So he's talked a lot about this open-mindedness, so you can really capitalize on events. So things, might happen, but you need to also capitalize on the fact that they're there. And this often happens. For example, you might be in a conference and you meet somebody new, and you start talking and you realize that you really connect on something. And most people probably wouldn't take it further, but in this today's world, it's important to actually, keep that open mind to see it. At the very least, I should be exploring this to see if I can really capitalize on the fact that I've met this person. And then in terms of goal setting, in this changing world, as I mentioned, it's impossible to know where your career might end. So you have to set sort of goals which are give you a sense of direction, but also flexible enough to change given the moving circumstances. And Grunwald identified 5 key skills that you need in order to create these opportunities and create and leverage, chance, these opportunities arising. I've already spoken a little bit about curiosity. And curiosity is a proactive approach to learning about things. So, a lot of people tend to be, especially in today's world in which you're probably under a lot of pressure in your daily job, and so you just focus on putting one foot in front of the other and accomplishing what it is that you set out that day. But you also need to sort of create a little bit of space for curiosity and wanting to learn about these new things. Another factor is persistence, because the world is becoming much tougher. You might have a goal in mind, but it might be much more difficult to achieve it. So you do need that persistence to keep on going, despite maybe setbacks, etc., to finally get to where you want to go. Flexibility, we've spoken already a little bit about, but having that flexible attitude that takes account of changing circumstances. Optimism, being, I guess, curious and optimistic to me are fairly close to each other, but having that sense that actually all these new opportunities is a good thing, not a nightmare and what a bad thing. So having a sense that actually what all these changes are bringing are actually good things, because then you look at new opportunities as something which is possible and attainable for you. And finally, this idea of risk-taking, getting out of the comfort zone, saying, look, I don't mind, how it might be turning out. I mean, one of the classic books on job hunting is called What Color is Your Parachute? And Richard Bowles named the book What Color is Your Parachute for a very specific reason, which is, often career transition or job change means jumping out of a plane and you have no idea whether you're going to land and where you're going to land. But actually, if you have a good parachute, you'll just float your way down to the place where you need to go. So risk-taking is taking that leap, putting in place the plan that I'll be talking about, but you do at some point need to take that leap and say, yes, I'm going to go for it, at the very least try it out, because even if it doesn't work out, I'll learn something from that. So I guess to summarize a little bit this section, I really like this quote. Thomas Carlyle was a Scottish philosopher, which is, in today's world, career management is very much about going as far as you can see. Once you're at the top of the peak, you can, understand, okay, which is going to be my next step. You complete that next step, and then you go further. So, this idea that I'm going to know my future, the classic question, where do you see yourself in 10 years' time, is completely absurd in an interview nowadays, because, we don't know from one year to the next where we're going to be. So. So key to success in all this process, I think there is first, I guess, some self-analysis about how we react to change. To get a good understanding of, understanding yourself or reflecting about yourself in terms of when change happens. And this can be they've decided to change a policy in your organization, or they've decided to change the structure of an operation. How do we tend to react to that change? It's also knowing very much about yourself, and I'll be going into that a bit in more detail. But key to success is having a good understanding of what we're good at and what we enjoy doing, because that's what you're going to be communicating. In interviews, that's what you're going to be communicating in application letters. That's what you're going to be infecting with enthusiasm to the people that you meet, that effectively communicate the fact that you can do these things for them. So it's about understanding, how good you are at these things, but also about communicating this. And often we're very good at things, but we're not very good at communicating them. So some of the webinars will be focused on helping you communicate your skills and who you are much more effectively. And of course, we also have to keep that antenna open and this very proactive approach to really looking at what employment opportunities are out there. As I mentioned, often the day-to-day work absorbs us and we forget to look, actually, get a good understanding what other people are doing. Is that interesting? How do they spend their day? What are the key skills required to really have this proactive attitude to really understanding what opportunities might be available for you. Now, you will have seen in your previous life that people react to change in very different ways. And it's very interesting because I think it depends on two factors. It depends very much on where we are in the what they call the transition curve. I'll explain in a second what that is. Whether that change was driven by yourself or it was driven by others, of course, has a huge makes a huge difference. But where we are on the transition curve is very important, but also personality. On the weekend, I was listening to the BBC have on Saturday mornings, they have a program called Outlook, and they were interviewing two people that had been confronted with the very worst news, which is you're going to die. And it was how they spoke about it, and especially one man, extraordinary. I mean, he started off with a sore throat and ended up 2 weeks later with no arms, no legs, and with gangrene, because of this general infection. And his attitude to something so terrible was so incredibly positive, and I find it very difficult to relate to how positive he was about it. But some people might just think that's it. I really don't want to live. I've got no arms, no legs. Why on earth should I continue living? And yet this man's attitude was extremely positive about his experience. So it does depend very much on how your personality is. And it also depends on, as I mentioned, this concept of the transition curve. Now, the transition curve, generally, when you tend to get news that I need to make this transition, either driven by yourself or driven by others, the first thing is anxiety. As I mentioned, as human beings, we don't like uncertainty. We don't like being in unfamiliar territory. So the first thing is around anxiety, and can I cope with this change or not? Often, because of the anxiety, it leads to a phase of denial, which is, hopefully if I keep my head low enough, this awful experience is going to pass. So I'll just kind of pretend it's not even there. Then if it's been driven by others, often it goes into a phase of a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, a victimization also, why me? But often a lot of anger. Then, of course, fear, because you're fully taking account of what the situation is, and so you're thinking about how is it going to affect me, and how is it going to affect my family if I'm responsible for others. And ideally, one should get to the point of acceptance, that you've now fully understood that this change is taking place, and so you've come to terms with it, because only once you've reached this phase can you actually start going towards more positive, okay, what can I do about this change? So now, okay, I've accepted, now I realize what I need to do. And then once you start getting an understanding of what your next goal is, you start actually basically having the energy to say, okay, now I'm motivated, I'm going to get on with it. This is what I need to get on with. And finally, when you've gone into the final phase, it's very much about actually, I'm learning a lot through this process of transition. It's given me opportunities that I never would have considered beforehand. There is a Chinese saying of a door closed is another 1,000 open. So you get finally to a phase, hopefully, in which you've accepted the change, you've made the change, and then actually you start realizing that that was actually quite a good thing for you. So I think accepting that any kind of change has, and this transition curve can be applied to all situations, to relative passing away, to relationship breaking up, to work breaking up as well. So it's I think a very useful model for at least taking account of the fact that all these emotions are absolutely natural and they're absolutely part of the process. Now, Kubler-Ross, she was a psychologist. She worked in a hospital, and she actually developed this theory based on people who'd got the terrible news. So it's extraordinary because even people that have received that news, which is you have 2 or 5 months to live, she identified that they went through exactly the same steps. And if you don't take fully account of each of the steps, I think that the worst thing is to be stuck in one of the steps. Usually we get stuck in anger and the emotion, or you're paralyzed by fear. And I think if you don't take account of the fact that these things are happening, it's going to be very difficult for you to move to the next phases of acceptance in order to actually start making, the real transition. So I hope it's a useful model for you. I think understanding where you are in the curve can sort of help you, take account of it, which is absolutely natural that you should, but also give you an understanding that this is a process that you have to go through, and that hopefully you will come out the other end in this phase of growth. Now, to put it in another way, I heard this saying in a concert in Madrid when I was 18, I think, or no, maybe I was 20. Johnny Clegg, the white Zulu, said it in the concert, and if the future doesn't come to you, you have to go in search of the future. I think in today's world, given the way that the world works, I find this quote very inspiring. But to be sitting waiting for things to happen is no longer possible in today's world. As I mentioned, it was very possible in my dad's time, not anymore. I think it's the responsibility for managing your career and developing your career is not 100%, but fairly squarely in the hands of the employee nowadays. So that's a little bit an introduction to career planning, and now I'll go into the next part of the presentation, which is very much about planning your next step. So where do you start in this process? Well, I think it's very important to understand that there is a process around this, and I really like this quote. I read it when I was on a year off in India. If you don't know where you're going, you might end up somewhere else. So this is, again, going back to the theme of who's responsible for this. Do I wait for things to happen and maybe life will take me, somewhere? But that might mean that you might end up somewhere where you don't want to be. So, having this more proactive approach is important. Now, what's interesting is that because I was in India, I thought, yogi, he must be somebody extremely wise, somebody in a dhoti with a long white beard, etc. So I looked him up in Google search, and Yogi Berra was actually a 1950s baseball player and trainer. So it made me laugh at the time because you could see that wisdom comes from everywhere. It not necessarily from a cave up in the Himalayas. So the first question I would have for you around all this process of planning your next step is think back on your careers, and the question for you would be, how good are you at setting goals? Because often most of us, I would contest, haven't really set goals at all. We've kind of fallen into something at the beginning of our careers, and then that's kind of taken us to different places. Again, we're talking about having this proactive approach to taking ownership for your career, and we do, as human beings, have a problem with setting goals. You know, often we ignore its importance for a start. Often nobody's taught us how to do this, so we have absolutely no idea how would I even go about setting goals. Maybe you don't have a role model. You know, somebody, I want to be like them in 10 years' time, and so that also gives us a little direction. Often there's a lack of motivation or desire, you know, not that bothered by it. And then often, you know, in today's world, we run very busy lives, taken up by lots of email and meetings, etc. So we actually have a very practical lack of time and above all space for reflecting on all of this. And then for some of us, we do have a problem with setting goals because we have a fear of failure. We have a fear of rejection. You know, maybe if I come up with this idea, you know, people are going to say, "Don't be ridiculous. How on earth, you know, would you like to be this? That's absurd." We feel very pessimistic. Oh, that's never going to happen. You know, we low self-esteem. So, oh, I'm not capable of doing anything, and I can't do it. And that often leads to procrastination, which means, you know, I'm going to sit on the sofa and hopefully something will happen. But this is just too difficult. I'm just going to postpone even thinking about this. And why does this happen? Because of what they call the paradox of human motivation. You know, all of us shift between this line of, you know, we all try and move away from aversion towards things like pain, anxiety, doubt, and insecurity. And in a perfect world, we want to move towards, you know, we have a desire for meaning in our lives, for freedom, for creativity, for security. I'm sure we could make a much longer list, but just to give you an idea, that we have this, we tend to live in this axis in which we're trying to move towards things that make us feel more secure. You know, there's Maslow's triangle of hierarchy of needs, you know, towards feeling loved, feeling fulfilled, and hopefully to the last phase of self-actualization. But what happens, you know, in our desire to set these goals and move towards these things, often we have a problem with setting goals, and it creates a situation of absolute panic. You know, I don't want to think about this. This is too uncomfortable. I'm not going to be able to do it. All those things that I talked about: fear of failure, fear of rejection, low self-esteem, pessimism, etc. And because it becomes such an uncomfortable thing, then actually what we do is to go the other way, so to move away from those things. And again, this is the reason why we tend to procrastinate often in setting goals. So what happens? Well, often we don't set any goals at all, so we just leave it to chance. Barry Schwartz, who's the creator of this concept of the paradox of choice, he calls it, we become pickers, which means that, you know, instead of actually choosing what we want to do, you know, opportunities are passing by in front of our eyes, and we just pick at whatever happens to be there. But it might not necessarily be the best thing for us. So we just basically leave it to chance. Often people with low self-esteem have a tendency to either to do what they call goal incongruity, which is either you set goals which are so easy peasy that of course you're going to be able to do it, or you know, I want to be the president of the United States, and I'm not even American. So you set that goal because you know it's never going to happen. Or you set goals that are so vague that they're not goals at all, so they're not SMART goals, and this especially happens with people who are in a panic about job hunting, is that you start what they call the activity trap, which is you do a lot of things, but they're not the most effective things for you. So yeah, sending 100 CVs a day to different people that you have absolutely no idea what they need, but I'm going to send the CV anyway because who knows, you know, at some point they might need me. So you end up doing a lot of activity, which gives you a sense that maybe you're getting somewhere, but actually it's not very effective. And then finally setting goals based on, you know, fear rather than faith, meaning you're never going to get out of the comfort zone, you're never going to develop or try new things. So it's just to give you an overview of what tends to happen when it comes to planning our next step, that we do have that first barrier of of a problem with setting goals. So you need to be very aware of that in order to overcome it. So Where do you start with all of that? So this is the framework that I would like to present for you. I think it's an extremely useful framework for career management. In today's world, I think it should be something that you revisit every couple of years, maximum every 3 years. And so where does it all start? Well, with some assessment.
Rosie,
I know that.
before you,
Yep.
sorry, before you continue, there have been a number of different questions all around the same topic, which is how can the volunteers leverage their UNV experience? In particular, I have 3 comments. One, which is about a colleague who was advised that the UNV assignment and the UNV experience is not conducive to career progression. The other one is actually about the short-term contracts that, for example, volunteers are under, and how can they plan their career when there is such a short time frame. And another one is a little bit vaguer, kind of more generic in terms of career planning is difficult as a UN volunteer. So what can we do? So perhaps when we're looking now at the where do I start? Perhaps we can also see within the restrictions of, for example, having a short time frame or having what I would call an unorthodox career at the moment, which is the volunteer assignment. And how can we leverage that, or is that leverageable? And, where do we move from that?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I will certainly be touching on that. I might not touch on it immediately because I want to present the framework, and then we can discuss on how you apply that in a UNV setting. Just as you were talking, Marcia, I immediately remembered Marcus Dolder, the head recruiter for the ICRC, and I remember sitting in a presentation that he gave, and he said, "Look, I've been working temporarily for ICRC for 25 years," and I laughed, because it's the concept of everything's on short-term contracts. You never know what's going to happen in your next assignment. Am I going to have a job or not at the end of your contract? But he'd been doing that for 25 years with the same organization. So I think the shortness of the contract, of course, conditions what you can do in each of those contracts. But that said, again, in this world today, it's true that UN volunteers suffer from a very particular, short-term contract a situation. But I think in terms of how to leverage each of those contracts to make sure that you're building the skills, you're building the knowledge that you need in order to make sure that you're then assigned to the next place is the same whether you're a UNV or whether you've been working at UNHCR on an FTL for 2 years.
Thank you.
So it's true that you have to revisit that process a lot more frequently, and that you suffer certain challenges because you're trying to do your work, and at the same time you're already thinking about what's my next contract going to look like. But I would say that in terms of the framework, it's the same.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
But I hope to be able to touch on it in a more depth once I presented the model.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So I think in terms of career planning, managing your career, etc. This concept of self-assessment, it has to be, it's your foundation. It's who you are. It's what you can offer. It's what you need to develop. And so it all has to start, and I'm sure the logisticians amongst you or people who are working in supply will know this very, very well, because it all has to start with stock taking. How do you know what else you need to bring in unless you actually understand really what's in the warehouse? And so I guess another question I would have for the audience is how well do you really know yourself? Because actually often we don't know ourselves as well as we could do. I think it's a lifelong process. Arguably you never do know yourself. But in terms of the practicalities of managing your career, how aware are you of your strengths and what you have to offer? Equally important, how aware are you of what you need to develop? None of us are perfect, and we're never going to reach perfection. And having that attitude that actually I always have something to learn, be it managing others, be it managing myself, be it managing time, be it prioritizing, be it communicating, etc. We all have things to develop, and you need to have if you want to develop in your careers, you have to also develop yourself. So having an attitude of being, very aware of what are the areas of development is also extremely important. And then the final factor is and I think this is a factor for happiness. Are you really aware of what's most important to you? Because often life takes us in a direction in which actually we really don't care and we don't want to be, but for some reason you're there. And I think unless you really understand what's really important to you and base your career and your life on those things, it's going to be very difficult to find happiness. I mean, happiness is never permanent, but at least some level of of happiness. And why is this important? Because as I mentioned, we're really not that. There's now a lot of books on neurology in terms of how we take decisions. And, the one thing that we've realized is that we're not actually that good at knowing ourselves. And, while having a certain level of confidence is very good because it helps you confront whatever happens to you in life, it's also very important to have a certain level of humility in terms of I always have something to learn. And just to give you a few pointers of what that might mean, almost all of us and believe that we're much better drivers than everybody else. That's, statistically impossible. 25% of us believe we're in the top 1% in our ability to get on with others. Again, that's statistically impossible. We all think that we're much lower risk than our peers of suffering a heart attack, and most of us believe that we're much more likely to provide accurate self-assessment than our colleagues. So we know ourselves much better than the man or the woman next door. And again, this is statistically impossible. Some of us are probably quite good at this, and a lot of us are really not very good at this at all. So I think having that level of understanding that actually maybe we have something to learn around this is very, very important. And it's extremely important in career management transition. Because being self-aware is above all going to be very useful in communicating it, and that can be in your job day to day, but also in the process of job search. So you need to be able to talk about yourself and the impact that you have on your work. And on the other hand, very, very important in knowing and addressing your limitations. Most of you will have experience in interviews. Sometimes they ask this question in a very direct manner, what are your weaknesses? And why do they ask that? Are they particularly interested to know what your weaknesses are? No, what they're looking for is self-awareness. Are you aware of the things that you need to develop, and what are you doing about it? And that's why they ask that question. So it's the whole process of understanding yourself is extremely important for yourself above all, but then also for these very practical reasons in terms of if you don't know what you need to develop, you're never going to do it, and then also communicating what you have to offer. And so what kind of things should you start self-assessing on? Well, there are things around your values, which is how do you like to work, your sense of autonomy, your need for variety, what you're interested in, of actually really understanding what am I most interested in, because that will help you focus what kind of function or sector you should work in, and within that sector, what particular area you're most interested in. Your strengths. We like to talk in the career management world about motivated skills, which are things that you're not only good at, but actually really gives you a kick when you're using them. So I, for example, love connecting people. I get a real kick out of, getting two people together for the benefit of both. Now, is it a skill? I guess relatively, but it is something that when I connect people and it works out for them, I feel I've had a great day at work. So identifying those skills, really important. Career history, kind of doing a reflection of how your career has gone, what have been the highs and the lows. I think it's an interesting thing to look at because it might help you understand who has driven your career in the past. Has it been you? Has it been circumstance? Has it been your parents? It's just getting an understanding of maybe how these decisions took place. When did you react? But above all, it's just a reflection to understand what role did you play in all this process, so that in the future you play a more proactive role. Job satisfiers is about, you know, really having an understanding of what makes you walk out of the office one day and feel, you know, has given you huge satisfaction, because if you can find your next job with those elements, then you're going to have a much happier work life, your preferred lifestyle, the type of work environment that you like to work, and then what your constraints are actually some very you know, practical things. Often we're dragged away from thinking about your constraints because you don't want them to limit you, but ultimately when it comes to taking decisions, you know, they tend to appear. So it's very important to be also aware of what those constraints might be. Because at the very least, in terms of planning your next step, etc., in career counseling we always talk about 3 areas. The first is you know, this idea of motivated skills, because that can basically help you identify which job functions require those skills. Your values, you know, again, it's how you like to work, and so some job functions, or this can be also organizational. You know, if you're somebody who's extremely autonomous, then working in a very hierarchical situation is probably going to cause you some stress, because you're going to have, you know, your boss breathing down your neck, and actually you like the autonomy, so maybe you're better off working in a flatter organization where you are given all that responsibility. So getting, you know, some clarity around that can help you, again, define what kind of job function, what kind of organization, and then your interests. Very important, because it can very quickly help you understand what kind of sectors would I work in. Should I remain in the humanitarian sector? Would I like to go back to the health sector because I'm a doctor? Or should I go back to the logistics sector if I work in logistics? So it's just getting some clarity around these 3 things, because that will help you sort of get some definition about what your next step might look like. The presentation, Martia will have it and she'll send it out to all of you. This is just some suggestions of things that you can look at in terms of doing that self-assessment. You know, these are just tools that help you get some clarity of where your strengths might be, what are the values that are important to you, what type of preferences you might have in terms of personality. So the MBTI or the Myers-Briggs types indicator is a classic. You know, some of these tools, you can find them for free on the internet. Others, like Career Leader, which is a very validated tool, but it is expensive. It's $95. It's developed by 2 psychologists from Harvard Business School, and it's a very comprehensive report that basically evaluates you in terms of your interests, your strengths, and your values. So now, a caveat when you're doing these self-assessment tools, they're not infallible for a start, but I think they do provide a good basis for discussion. So on the one hand, you get the report, and I think it's very, very interesting to get feedback from colleagues, from friends, from significant others, because often we have blind spots, and so things that you don't see, you know, they might actually say, no, you know what, you are a very stubborn person, and this is how it reflects in your communication style or whatever it is. So it's good. Again, it is all about knowing yourself in order to understand where you need to develop. And then a final caveat on these self-assessment tools is that the fact that none of us are written in stone. I think the wonderful thing about human beings is that we can develop in a lot of different ways. You know, we all have different capacities for development. And for example, I've seen the most introverted people become excellent communicators. So the fact that your tendency is, look, I'd rather not be out there talking to people, doesn't mean that you can't do it. It's just you have to find your own style and way of doing it. So don't take these as literal, oh, this is the type of person I am and therefore I can't be anything else. Now, if you do embark on this process of doing these different self-assessment exercises, what, you know, in planes, in cars, etc., we have what we call the dashboard. So speed, oil, revs, or whatever else is on a car. I think when you go on through this process, do the same thing for yourself. And just the bottom line conclusions, put them on a single sheet. And this will help you in interviews. because a lot of these, as I'll show you, answer very basic interview questions. But it helps you also to avoid the confusion of all that words and all those millions of things that they say in the reports. Just start a dashboard with the bottom line, which could be around your top strengths, your areas of development, what are the things that really satisfy you in work, what are the skills that you most like using, what are your top values and your interests, etc. Because they do answer very fundamental questions. What do you look for in a job is a classic interview question. What is it that motivates you about applying here? And you can say, no, my top interest is career management, and I love human development. So this is why I'm applying for this job. And what do I look for? Well, I want a job in which I can develop mutually beneficial relationships, because it's something that gives me a kick out of life, etc. Okay, and then in terms of the strengths and the motivated skills, as I say, you're going to have to prove these in an interview process. You're going to have to prove these in an application process. So very, very important to understand, what those are, because if you don't know what they are, it's going to be very difficult for you to express them. So that would be the first phase, and I would also encourage anybody throughout their careers to get a lot of feedback from colleagues, the people that work with you day to day, and in any of the projects that you work on or a presentation, ask for feedback. Most people are very kind, and they'll give good constructive feedback, and if they don't, ignore them, because the whole point of asking for feedback is to understand where you have to improve. But as I say, we have blind spots, and unless we actively seek that feedback, it's going to be very difficult to, again, get that extra awareness. So once you've done a self-assessment, then you can go to the explore phase. And I think, again, in our day-to-day, we're not thinking about this too much, but I think having that awareness, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, of what your options potentially might look like, is really important, because you've got to start somewhere. And it can be quite open. You brainstorm. I've thought about this, I've thought about that, but you need to start with this process of brainstorming what potentially your options might look like. This is just one example. If I was working in logistics in the humanitarian sector, and I was thinking about my next step, what type of things might I, look at? Well, of course, I want to stay in the humanitarian sector. I love the mission. I love what we do. It's a sector that I know well. So, one option would be staying within the humanitarian sector. And what options might I have? Well, maybe, if I've done logistics, I've also maybe worked in procurement, or I've worked in warehouse management, or, as an engineer, etc. I've also worked in issues around operations and project management. So, just to brainstorm again, the different job functions of what my next step might look like, and other than the humanitarian sector, let's look out of the box. Why don't I also look at other sectors? I really like logistics, so maybe I look at the transport sector, or I happen to love retail, and it's actually a very important sector in my country. So why don't I look at retail? Because retail needs to move things around very quickly, on time, fresh in the case of supermarkets or whatever. So this is a sector that I might also find very interesting. So I encourage you to come up with a matrix of what those options might look like. It's just a very structured way of actually exploring options, rather than, oh, I've thought about this and maybe I've thought about that, but they're not exploring it systematically. Another example, if I was working in health, maybe you're a doctor and then you join the humanitarian sector as a health officer, a public health officer. Again, you have the option of staying within the sector, and if you stay within, doing what you were doing before, but maybe, doing other things. And maybe, okay, what are my other options? Maybe actually I want to go back home and I'll rejoin the public sector as a doctor, or actually maybe I could also do research, or actually I want to do nutrition, or maybe actually, why not? I'll go into the private sector. I feel that my experience that I've gained in developing countries on forgotten diseases can be extremely interesting to the pharmaceutical companies that are actually investing in new medication for these diseases. So again, it's just I would be as creative at this point as you can. think out of the box, maybe even fantasize. I want to work in a circus. I don't know. Something completely different that you've always loved acrobatics, and why not? I've got a chance to try something new. At the very least, I'm going to explore it seriously. And how do you do that exploration? Well, of course, nowadays we have a huge amount of information at our fingertips just by having access to the internet. So you can do some desktop research, sector publications, you can look at media articles on the sector, what's happening there, maybe there are industry reports, but all of this is a process of gathering information so that you can at some point get to the point of taking a decision. Because one of the reasons why we find career planning so difficult is that we don't have information. And the analogy that I tend to draw is, if you were having to do something, a big investment, like buying a car, would you just walk into the first shop and buy a car? No. You'd probably, visit different brands and distributors of those brands. You'd talk to friends that are driving those cars. You'd look at brochures to understand what are the different technicalities of these cars. You'd even test drive a car. And it's a process that we do very, very naturally for big investments, but we don't do it for something as fundamental as our next step, which is where we're going to spend at least 8 hours, minimum 8 hours a day. And it's going to have a huge impact on our personal development and our life. So, this process of exploration is super, and it's a process that most of us tend to jump. We just go straight for applying for positions without doing the research. And often at our cost, because we don't have the information we need in order to position ourselves correctly when it comes to the applications. So, please do some research around, again, brainstorming first options, and then start doing some research. But I do actually think that the best source of information is people. So in each of those options that you might be considering, find at least, ideally 5, but I would say at least 3 people doing the roles that you're considering in the type of organizations that you're considering. And why at least 3? Is what they call triangulation. The FBI use it before homing in on a suspect, that you need to get different sources of information talking about the same thing, so that you can be, it's not an opinion, it's actually a trend, and so it's something which is much more certain to be truth rather than just somebody's particular opinion. And this is what they call informational interviewing. Again, it's something we don't do. I find that people love helping people, and above all, they love talking about what they do. It makes them feel important, and it makes them feel, that I can give, something to somebody else. So, by all means, ask people. This is purely exploration. I need information that will help me decide what my next step might look like. So in order to do this, you need to start really mapping. Some of you might have already done this, but you really need to start mapping who you know. You're working in different operations in different countries. You have, of course, the most immediate network, which would be your personal network of your family and friends, but also, you've studied a certain degree, and you've probably met people that have then gone into different things with that degree. In your work, in all these different assignments that you might have had, you've met lots of people coming into the office, leaving the office, etc. And you have to actually systematically start writing down who do you know, because all of these people could be a source of information, and then potentially even opportunities. So very, very important to map out who it is that you know. And what do you ask in these informational interviews? Well, there's lots of questions that one can ask in informational interviews, but I think at the very least, especially if you're looking to make a transition into something you've never done before, is getting a good understanding of, how do these people spend their day? Because from the outside, what people do, often you get a very distorted image. Often it looks really glamorous, and actually then when you get down to how these people spend their day, you think, no, for me, it would kill me to do that. I'd spend all day crunching numbers on an Excel. That would absolutely kill me. So really get an understanding of what are the responsibilities, and how do these people really spend their day, because that will require certain skills, and that will either suit you, your strengths and your interests, etc., or it won't at all. The next key question is, what are the key skills required to succeed in this role, or knowledge in this role? And again, it's just a way of then reflecting on, do I already have this, or will I need to develop this experience or this knowledge or these skills before I can really consider this as a step for me? What background do people typically have? Again, another question, do I already have this, or what's my next step to get this? How do I see this job function evolving? Again, this is about anticipating needs, understanding whether this is something that you want to do in the future, etc. So it's about keeping up to date with where that function is going, where that sector is going, etc., to make sure that you have those future skills and future knowledge in your plan, or to acquire those future skills and future knowledge in your plan. And then I think any occasion meeting with somebody who's more experienced or a bit down the line from you, etc., is asking for people on how do people get jobs? What's your advice? Because it's just a way of gathering information about how people really do get jobs. Because unfortunately, as I mentioned before, it's not taught at school. We all tend to apply online very religiously, but often it means that we're losing opportunities because a hell of a lot of people don't get jobs online. So really important to also use those opportunities to get an understanding of how the job market works. What do you need to do in order to make sure that you're very effective in that process? So those, for me, are the 5 key questions. Informational interviews, you can ask somebody, look, can I steal 20 minutes of your time? I just need some advice. I'm trying to decide whether this is an option for me or not. Often it becomes an hour and a half, 2-hour conversation, because as I say, people really like talking about what they do, how they see the sector evolving or the function evolving, etc. And it can become a very, very rich process of information gathering. Now, super important, especially if you're holding a number of interviews, etc., register your impressions, because this is very helpful in looking for trends, in looking, getting an understanding. In Spanish, they say that the wind takes the words away. So it's really, really important to make sure that you register your impressions. So when you look at those different interviews, you start getting these trends and this information that you'll need for defining what your next step might look like. Because ideally, this is a process of due diligence. Once you've interviewed all these people, I mean, this is a pretend one, so I just put, you thought that the transport sector might be really interesting for you, but you realize that only if you do logistics. For the other things, you're not interested. So it just helps you narrow down out of all that long list of things that potentially you might do. It helps you narrow down into some very specific things that you can start, really applying to. Because once you've done that exploration, what you need to do is to start focusing. It'd be wonderful to do everything, but you can't, because all of this takes time. So the more options you consider, the more you're going to have to spread your energy in all those options. So you do need to start focusing, and you need to start focusing because in the end, career decision making is, on the one hand, the things that you're really fascinated by. A fact sheet would be, sorry, it's a UNHCR term, but it's your CV, and also what you might be constrained by. And this needs to translate into something very specific in terms of a job role and the locations that you're going to be applying to. So you start that process, I guess, macro process of gathering information. Then you can start looking against, what things you're most interested in, where your background applies to this and what you might be constrained by. And then hopefully, again, you start narrowing down to some very specific job roles and locations. Career decision-making is very much about prioritizing what's important to you. In a perfect world, I remember a career counseling session with I must have been maybe 45-year-old executive, and he said, I want my next step. I realized that what I really like in life is windsurfing. So I want a job in which I can live by the beach and I can windsurf at least 2 hours a day. That I don't have to work very long hours, because I want a really good work-life balance. I also want to be paid a lot of money, and I also want to be in a much higher responsibility. And I kind of more or less pat him on the back and I said, look, Chris, when you find it, tell me about it, because I'll join you. So in a perfect world, we would have it all, but sometimes you can't. So you need to decide what's most important at that stage, at least, for you. And this is specifically important when you're trying to, for example, if you're trying to make a functional change and you don't have the experience, the expectation that you're going to make that functional change at exactly the same level of responsibility that you currently have might be too high. I'm not saying it's impossible, but if you don't have the experience, why should they be hiring you above somebody that does? So you might need to make a short-term sacrifice in terms of responsibility and therefore pay and grade, etc., in order to be able to make that functional change. And once you've consolidated your experience a little bit in the new function, then you can start thinking about moving up. So you need to basically start prioritizing what's important to you. And this is a tool. I'll actually send it to Marcia so that you can also do it. I think it's a fantastic tool that can be applied to all kinds of situations. Actually, a client the other day said, "Oh, I could use it for choosing between different partners." And I laughed and I thought, well, lucky for you, got the choice. But it's a model that can be used for any number of things. So in the case of this client, for example, they were looking for, what did they want for the next step? They wanted functional change. I want to change because I'm fed up doing what I'm doing right now. But I also want a promotion. I've been in my grade for a very long time, and I think it's time that I should be moved up. I also want to be in a duty station with good schools. They're the most popular at UNHCR in terms of applications because my kids are at an age in which I can't have them, badly educated. I also want to build my profile, and I also want a managerial role. And again, I started sort of discussing with him, gave him the exercise, and it was interesting because when he came back with it, you'll see on the right-hand column, basically what you do is that you compare each of those things that you think are really important in your decision making, you compare them against each other. So between functional change and promotion, he's marked 2. Between functional change and being in a place with duty stations, he marked 3. Between functional change and post-adjustment, he chose, I prefer the post-adjustment. And he was somebody that his first need was like, no, I'm fed up doing what I'm doing, I need to change. And it was very interesting after he did the exercise that actually, because what you do is once you've done that exercise, you start counting the number of times you've chosen each of the options, and this is what gives you the prioritized list on the right. And he sort of presented, look, I need that functional change above all. And actually, when it came down to it, what was most important to him was being in a duty station with good schools and actually going up in grade. So it just kind of helped him a little bit decide, okay, maybe my next step isn't about making this functional change. It's about actually going for a higher grade in a place where I can educate my kids.
What do you call this tool, Rosie? Some of the colleagues are asking.
It's got there are different decision-making tools. Actually, I can't remember off the top of my head what the tool is called. As I mentioned, I'll send it to you, and then you can send it or post it, wherever you put the recording. But another way of taking these decisions is, okay, I've got my list of all these things. I have to give one up. Which is the one that I would give up most easily? And you think, okay, they're all important to me, but actually the one that's least important is building profile. So you get rid of that. Then between the ones that are left, which is the one that's least important to me. So you go through that process until eventually you get to the one that's most important. That's another method for taking these decisions. But I find this one fantastic because you can start with a clean slate, and you can use it for not only what kind of functions you might be considering, but what locations. Maybe between you and your partner, you're having to decide between different locations, and which is going to be the priority one. Maybe because I know your family is in one of those locations, and so it just helps, basically prioritize, and it helps in all things, especially when you're choosing about your next step. There are some things that are not negotiable, that you really, really need to have in your next step, and there are other things that would be wonderful to have, but if you don't have them, it's not going to kill you. It's not going to burn you out. It's not going to make you feel, what on earth am I doing in this job? And I think a very mature way of taking career decisions is understanding you can't have it all, but understanding at least that the most important things that you want, you've got. So it's just a way of focusing, where you're going to next. But I'll send you through the exact name because, to be honest, I've just it's gone completely out of my head. I can't remember.
Yeah, no problem, Rosie. But this is a decision-making tool anyway, and then it will be shared later on. So that's the important bit. Thank you.
Yeah. So in terms of setting your goals, again, just a way of focusing also is on what they call career anchors. So, for example, if you're limited by location, and I would assume that you're not, because you have that flexibility of being from one place and you're working in another, etc. But if you were limited by location, then by definition, you're going to have to look at what opportunities are in that location. So you can't be so selective about the sectors, because maybe the sector that you really love has no activity in your location at all. But often, most of us kind of focus our careers on a certain sector or on a certain function. So some functions are much more equally distributed in different sectors. I gave you the example of logistics, for example. I mean, you can do logistics for any organization, any company. All organizations or companies need to move things about. They need to store things. They need operations, etc. So or finance, for example, finance is needed in all human resources in all sectors. But others, the sector itself and the humanitarian sector, it tends to have some functions which are very specialized to that sector. Human rights, for example, there's not that many sectors around human rights. So there's very specific roles that you can do within that. But in terms of setting your goals, again, it's just a way of, out of all those options you might be considering, you're going to have to anchor it in a certain, indicator of one of these three parameters, or maybe a couple of the parameters. But it's just, I like this quote by John Dileme, your results are the product of either your personal focus or your distractions. I mean, absolutely right. But focusing just helps in that process of your time is not unlimited. You have to focus the use of your time, and it's better if you do it once you've kind of decided on, okay, out of all the things that I might be considering, actually I'm going to focus on a specific sector, function, location, or a combination of those.
On this, Rosie, I have a specific question that is actually linked to let's say, the middle manager roles. And the question is, for people who have, let's say, 5 years of professional experience, they're not quite yet experts, and they want to know whether they should be focusing more on their thematic area. So, for example, on environment or gender, or rather on the functional area, so communication, advocacy, project management, and what is the right balance, and where, how can they keep options open, and what should they be focusing on, or what is best to focus on, because it's really a critical time to choose a bit your career when you're in this middle manager element.
Yeah. No, that's it's actually an excellent question. I think if you go for the path of specialization, the advantage is that by definition it's going to be less people working in it, and therefore employability is going to be something which is more or can be more guaranteed. But it also means that there's less positions, so it's that kind of balance between, if you're a generalist in theory. I mean, I remember a headhunter with me. I've done marketing, I've done sales, I've done human resources, and he said, oh, like you're like a Land Rover, a todo terreno. You can go in all kind of territory. And I said, yes, but I mean, actually, employers, what they're looking for is that level of special, 8 years of marketing experience, and so it becomes much more difficult. I think this is where your interest really needs to drive you. If you're somebody that loves the area of specialization that you're in, they always say that, very few people have vocations in life, but your vocation grows as you become an expert in a certain position. Now, whatever it is that you do, you need to be the very best at that, because by definition there are a small number of positions, and therefore you need to be somebody that is sought after for your high level of knowledge and expertise in that area. But what drives that decision has to be your personal interest, that you really love working in that. So that would be one thing I would say. The other is, even if you become an expert, and this is what happens when people start going up in the grades in any organization, the lower you are in the organization, the technical skills matter more. As you go up in the organization, it means increased responsibility, and that means you're going to have responsibility over budgets, and you're going to have responsibility over people. And managerial skills are super, super important. And what tends to happen within the UN system, because we're a very technical sector, if you like, is that people focus very much on the technical knowledge, on the expertise, and completely forget about their managerial skills. So I think if what you're looking for is, even if you are an expert, I would always recommend people to, as they're building their expertise and their knowledge, you also build all those managerial skills, because they're going to be very, very important in you being effective at a higher grade. And what I've experienced and what I've seen within the UN system is that often the people that fail at higher grades is because they haven't looked after the managerial side. You know, they haven't understood that is, and they fail on two counts. One is, if they get the position, you know, it's very stressful not to be competent at something. So, you know, they don't know how to manage a team properly. The conflict creates chaos, objectives aren't met, money is wasted, etc. So you have that side of it, but also there's nothing on your CV or your fact sheet to reflect the fact that you've got that managerial experience if you haven't, you know, proactively looked for it, and therefore you don't get appointed to the higher grades that you're looking for because you haven't developed that experience. So I think really, really important that when you're looking at your career, you're looking not only at the expertise side, you know, and acquiring that expertise and being, you know, point of reference for that expertise, but also look after these managerial skills. Now, in terms of the other route, which would be become a generalist, I think different organizations have different career paths. So you really need to look at, you know, how your organization is structured. I've worked with organizations that are incredibly flexible, and we're talking private sector now, but incredibly flexible and positively encourage a very generalist profile, because they're looking for their future managers, and they understand that a future manager, if they don't have a bit of an understanding of the logistics side, the financial side, the HR side, etc., it's going to be very difficult for them to be fully effective managers. And so if you're in that kind of organization, clearly the expertise side is a risk, because what they're looking for is, as I say, I mean, Nestle, to give you an example, one of the largest food companies, you will not get to the top of Nestle unless you've worked across different functions, unless you've worked across different business units, and unless you've worked across different geographic regions. So, you know, that's a private sector example. But within the UN system, you have to look at within your own organizations also whether that type of dynamic exists. You know, what is it that's most valued? Is it the expertise side or is it the generalist side? And based on that, you can start planning, okay, what should my short-term plans look like? And I have to say that, you know, in some organizations, what I've seen is that there's a kind of pendulum towards, you know, kind of, I guess, a value of expertise, and then they realize, no, if they're too expert, but they don't have a sufficient, again, this managerial competence gets undermined. So actually, no, we want generalists, and then it goes back again to the expertise. So it's a difficult one to gauge. But again, the only way that you can take those decisions is just ask as many questions as you can from senior managers to understand where things are going. So what makes sense for you to do in your next step. So once you've, I guess, focused, you know, you've gone through this process of first gathering brainstorming, gathering information, and starting to focus. I think what's very important in terms of then moving towards the implementation of your plan is to do gap analysis. You know, once you've identified, okay, these are the type of things where I see myself, you need to do that gap analysis of understanding. You know, I'm here. I want to get there. You know, how am I going to? How am I going to get there? Back planning is a concept that I'll show you a picture later of Daniel, who's my guru in all of this. And he says it's something that we do very naturally for a lot of things, but for some reason never apply them to career planning. You know, if I had to take a flight this evening, the flight's at 7 o'clock. I know I need to be at the airport an hour and a half before. It takes me half an hour to get to the airport. It takes me half an hour to pack. It takes me half an hour to get to my house from work. That's back planning. And we tend to try and use application processes to, I want to be there immediately without having taken the step of actually understanding, you know, if I want to be there, what do I need to have in order to get there? So very important to understand this concept of back planning. Because when you do your gap analysis, there's one of three options. Either you already have the profile, so all you need to do is, okay, now I'm going to apply in the most effective way possible, and we'll be running webinars on that. Then the second option is, I can get there, but only if I, get particular experience in this, or I need a special training on that. So that's your action plan of what am I going to do to get there. Or the conclusion might be, I want to be an astronaut. It might be a bit late for me, because I don't have the physics degree, I don't have the physical stamina that you need, and maybe not even the psychological wherewithal to be able to do it. But if I do that gap analysis of, okay, what's the profile of an astronaut? Can I fit some of these? And you realize, no, then it's just also a way of getting rid of options which are not viable for you. But I do believe a very high percentage of opportunities you might be looking at, either you already more or less have the profile, because these are the things that you've chosen what you do right now for a reason, so you're pretty much there. Or maybe, especially if you're looking to go upgrade or up in responsibility, you might actually still need to build some exposure to managing a team or managing budget, etc. So I think the key message here is, maybe you can't get there immediately, but so long as you have a plan of what you need to build to get there, you will get there. So it's just a way of being much more intelligent about your career planning. So based on that, you come up with your career plan if it's needed, because the gap, there is a gap, and then after that you go to the phase of building your profile. So ways in which you can build your profile in any job is talking to your manager. Hopefully you have a manager that is open to this, that enables you to expose you to a particular functional area through special projects, going on a mission, stretch assignments, shadowing a colleague, all these different on-the-job learning opportunities that you can broker these in order to build yourself, exposure to that functional area that will help you, build the profile that you need before you start applying. Because if you don't do that, it's going to be very difficult, as I mentioned, in the actual application process. There's a lot of competition, and why should they take you above somebody who already has experience? So super important in terms of building your profile is in your plan. To start thinking of ways in which you can build that profile, be it through training, be it through attending meetings and conferences, what relationships you need to build with people so that they get to know who you are, etc. Now, we're going to be running sessions specifically on this. I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time in terms of, the phase of positioning yourself, because we're going to be talking a lot about this. But the only key message I would say is two. I really like this image. Sell the problem you solve, not the product. That in terms of how we position ourselves, it is very much about identifying what problems they have, and then positioning yourself as a solution to those problems. And in order to do that, you need to do, again, your research. You need to really understand, okay, what's going on there? What's keeping the boss awake at night? How can I help him sleep better or her sleep better? So identifying first what challenges they might have, and so you can, basically be a problem solver rather than, somebody is like, give me a job. No. I also think it's very, very important in the processes of, if you can, identify who the decision makers, and then show them, how you can be the person that's, a solution to those problems. People often have this idea that somehow a manager will have some kind of X-ray that knows, can basically X-ray them and understand everything that's inside that person, what they do, what their potential is, etc. And people are busy, and we're not very observant about what others do. So it's really important in a very natural. I'm not talking about being brash about this. In a very natural way, just ensure that people know what it is that you're working on. And you can do this over in the canteen, over lunch, asking people about what they do, and then saying, oh, that's really interesting, because actually last week, we were working on this project and this is what we did. So exchange information, and in a very subtle way, make sure that people know what you do. Because when it comes to the actual process of applying for a job, etc., having a face behind the CV is extremely important. On paper, people look the same. It's, if you have 7 years, or I'm just trying to see the 10 years, 8, 9 years of experience in program management, and you're applying for a job at a certain grade, the likelihood that the other applicants also have that number of years of experience is pretty high. And the likelihood that they've worked on very similar type of projects and programs is probably pretty high. So it's really important, within what you can, is always to try and put a face behind the CV, because a personal impression accounts for 1,000 words. And immediately when you meet somebody, you start very, very quickly making conclusions about them. They're a problem solver, they're dynamic, we love having them around the office, they're optimistic, they bring the team together, they resolve conflict, etc. So in as much as you can, try and always, and especially with these short-term contracts, try and make always a positive personal impression, because it tends to override a lot of what's on the paper. So that's really, really important. And then finally, once you've really understood how to position yourself, because you understand what they need, etc., only then you start applying. Now, it's really important, this, because most of us tend to jump straight into the application. And as you see, there's quite a few steps that you need to take before you start applying blindly for positions. At the very least, if you do that, please find out really what do they need, and how can I, and then again, position yourself so that you're the person that can actually address those challenges. But really important that the application should only be at the last phase, that, this information gathering is just, if you were having to launch a product in the market, and I'm talking very private sector here, but just imagine you have to launch, I don't know, for the sake of argument, you have to launch a shampoo. Would you just launch it, or would you not try and find out actually who's going to use the shampoo, in what way are they going to use it, what's important to them? You do your market research in order to understand, what price you should be selling it, what kind of packaging you should have, what kind of promotion material should you have, etc. And it's a very basic thing, and that, all good, well-run organizations do. But we also have to do it for ourselves. So gather the information to really understand, okay, how, in what way am I going to position this product, and where? Because especially when it comes to applying online, essentially it's like a factory. UNHCR received 30,000 applications, external applications last year. That's a huge number of applications, and if I remember rightly, I think it was for 1,500 positions. So we're talking a lot of people applying, and it becomes, it's difficult to stand out, because, as I say, CVs have a tendency to look the same. On paper, people tend to look the same. We will be working on how to, by the way, do that a lot better than most people. But it is a process where it's difficult to stand out, and ultimately becomes a numbers game, which means you have to apply to a lot of positions before hopefully you're the little duck that's selected. And this is Daniel that I mentioned, my guru in all of this. So he's Europe's kind of answer guru in career management and job hunting. And one of the things that he says, that applications are a tool. It's just a means. It's not a job search strategy. So if you join this crowd of 30,000 applicants, is that necessarily how you're going to get the job? That's the process. You have to go through an application process. It has to be reviewed. You have to be interviewed, etc. But in terms of how you make those impressions, how you build your reputation, etc., that is outside an application process. So it's very, very important to build in, to do this process, A, as well as you can, and B, to do more than just simply applying for positions. And why is that? I like this kind of graph. You'll see that on the axis going up, you have, how much you fit. with what you're applying to. And then also on the axis, on the horizontal axis, is your level of activity. Now, if you fit 100% to the position that you're applying to, you can afford to be relatively passive in the process, which means you just submit a good application, and that's it. Now, if you don't fit, the less you fit, because you're a career changer, so you're changing sectors, maybe you're changing functions, etc., the more proactive you're going to have to be. And again, you have these two sides, which on the one hand is just behaving like an applicant. So I'm applying, hopefully give me a job, or really being proactive and presenting yourself as a problem solver. And most of us, again, because we're not taught how to do this, tend to focus on just apply for a job, and then hopefully at some point it's going to work out. But often that comes at the expense of a loss of opportunity because we haven't been more proactive. And there's no better way of showing motivation than being proactive. If you want to show a manager that you really want to work for them, show them how you can solve their problems. So it really shows that you really want that job and you're motivated for it. So I guess I've presented that model fully, and we come to the conclusion. So in terms of key in all of this to planning your next step is understanding your own reactions to uncertainty and change. Going through this process of self-assessment. I think it's a nice process to go through, very reaffirming. Exploring your options systematically. Doing your gap analysis, and then on the basis of that, setting your development and action plan, and then finally positioning yourself for applications. So just as a final slide, this is Latin America. So this is Christopher Columbus in Barcelona, pointing actually towards Genoa. And a very interesting thing about Christopher Columbus, who arguably discovered America, is that it took him 8 years to get the sponsorship he needed to set out. So we're talking about resilience and persistence here. His map at the time showed that Japan was across the Atlantic Ocean, 2,700 miles away, and Japan actually was 12,000 miles away. And lucky for him, certainly not for Native Americans, America was in the way. And he went down in the history of humanity, or at least Western history of humanity. And this is the best example of planned happenstance. It's that you have some kind of an objective, but you don't really know fully what that end is going to look like. But if you put in place all the right blocks in place, ultimately wonderful things can happen for you. So that would be my final message, and more than happy to take any questions. I know I've talked for a very long time.
Thank you. You must probably be feeling the need to rest or drink a glass of water. There has been a lot of action here on the chat box. There has been already also an agreement to create a discussion forum where continuously discuss various issues about volunteers, the UNV assignment, and how to best leverage and maximize the idea. There is also a lot of questions on what are some of the topics of the next webinar. So there have been people asking about tools for job interviews. They've been asking about coaching for interviews. They've been asking about how to write CVs and motivation letters. So all of this will be touched upon, I guess, more in detail during the other webinars. This is just the first one of the Career Management and Transition series. But perhaps we go back to the idea that I see is quite widespread about how a UNV assignment is somewhat considered a bit less than, in inverted commas, a real job. How sometimes this is not, the experience on a UNV assignment is not considered as a professional experience by some of the agencies, and what can the volunteers do to really kind of build on this experience and bring out some of the key elements, some of the skills, the knowledge, and the attitudes they've learned during this assignment to bring to their next step, let's say, professional step. So perhaps we can spend a couple of minutes on that. And what I would also encourage the colleagues online is that we can also collect perhaps some of the questions. We can put them on this forum, and then we can try and answer them also, let's say, offline, so that we try and close at 5 o'clock. Go, Rosie.
Okay, I mean, I guess I'll address first the concept of the UNV assignment. I think there are two aspects here. The first is when you have one of these assignments, you're also in the driving seat. It's not just the organization saying, look, this is your assignment, this is what you need to do. I think if you're always a step ahead in terms of, okay, what can I do for this assignment? What am I going to build in this assignment to make sure that, when the next thing I've already built the experience or the skills or the knowledge that I need. And this is where you need to be a little bit proactive as well. So on the one hand, the organization is hiring you for a very specific reason, and so you have to comply with what they're asking for. But at the same time, they always say it takes two to tango. You can also be very proactive in talking to your manager, saying, look, yeah, of course, these are all my objectives, this is what I'd like to do. Can I also work on this? Because I feel that I need to develop some more knowledge or skills or experience in that. So be also proactive in that process of building your profile yourself, because that's what's going to really prepare you for the next things that you apply to. That would be one point. The second point is when it comes to UN volunteer experience, at least my experience at UNHCR, that's not the case at all. One thing is whether people are being given internal status to apply or not, etc. But in terms of the experience itself, we value UNHCR experience, and we don't. I mean, the fact that you might have done it under an FDL contract, under an affiliate workforce contract, or under a TA, we know that the job content is the same. So we value the same experience. Now, like any candidate applying to a job, what we do want to make sure is that we want to know what you've been doing. And some people are very good at describing what they've been doing, and other people really are not. And this is where the future sessions in terms of building an effective CV, writing effective motivation letters, or preparing for interviews are extremely important. Because if you're not able to I mean, I'm thinking actually of an IUMV that I interviewed twice for two separate positions in two separate countries, and it was a tragedy because on paper, she looked as if she had the right experience, etc., but she wasn't able to convey this in the interviews. And we were more than happy. She was the only one out of the three candidates that had UNHCR experience. So on principle, we would have been much more biased towards having her rather than somebody that has no knowledge of the organization. But she didn't perform in the interview. And in fact, in the second interview, when I saw her name, I thought, interesting. Let's hope she performs better. And she wasn't better. So it's not only what experience you have, it's just making sure that you package it in a way that is going to be interesting to the organizations that you apply to. But I think if your experience is a worthwhile experience in terms that you're applying knowledge, skills, I don't think it matters whether you have a UNV contract or whether you have something else, because I don't think UNVs have a reputation for being given lesser assignments. So what we look at is the content of what you've done rather than the type of contract, is my point.
Thank you, Rosie. And since I see that there is no more questions coming in, perhaps I can do a little bit of summary of my takeaways from this session. So first of all, thank you so much, Rosie. This has been most interesting. And I have proof of that from the chat. Everybody is absolutely delighted with the content you provided, the insights, very useful tips. So thank you so much for that, first of all, even though it's just the first one of a series, but definitely looking forward to the next one. For me, in terms of takeaways, I understand that we need to take the opportunities when they come and as they come. We need to be able to be flexible enough to plan short term. There is no more such thing as the job for life. And the important element of this is that we need to take ownership of our career. We need to take charge. We need to be at the steering wheel. In the same line, I would actually answer some of the questions about the UNV assignment. As a former UN volunteer myself, I always found the experience of the UNV assignment as a really wonderful and rewarding experience, which has definitely paid off in terms of my career progression, in terms of gaining new skills and gaining an understanding of what it means to work for the United Nations and what means to work for the United Nations system. So to answer the original question from Carolina, what we say, it is true. We say that UNV is not an entry point to the UN system, but is definitely a way to be more aware of what the path might look like in the United Nations. It does not guarantee you with a job in a UN agency, but it definitely gives you a bit the upper hand by knowing what to expect, by knowing how it works, by knowing inside the internal movements and processes, as Rosie was saying as well for UNHCR. So this is what you make of it again. So this again is about taking charge of this experience and what you make of it, how you then leverage this, maximize what you've learned during the assignment to then apply to the next job. And I would also like to give you some homework. And really look at mapping the roles that you would like to explore in terms of the function that you currently have, and see what are the different options available there, and perhaps also identify the 3 people for each role to interview. So that we can really start looking into this into a much more concrete level. So that for the next webinar, we have done some more homework and we're ready also to look better on how to approach the job market.
Sounds good. I'll send you Marcia, the latest presentation and also the decision-making model, sort of tool for taking decisions.
Fantastic. So, Rosie, do you want to say a last word, a last recommendation before we close?
I mean, the only thing I would say, it's been a real pleasure. Unfortunately, with a go-to system, I can't see the chat, which is quite fun. When you're doing a presentation, also seeing the chat. But it's been a real. It sounds like you've been active on there, and it's been a real pleasure being with you this afternoon, and hopefully meet you in the next coming webinars.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rosie. Thank you to you, participants, and see you the next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.